Marvel and DC don't always kill their heroes. Sometimes they erase an entire generation at once. One reboot, one relaunch, or one major editorial decision can push dozens of characters out of the spotlight overnight. Sidekicks, legacy heroes, and rising stars who seem destined to lead the future suddenly become irrelevant as continuity shifts around them. They didn't fail individually. The generation itself was abandoned. In some cases, years of stories were effectively wiped away. But how do publishers make a whole era of heroes disappear? Here are 10 times Marvel and DC erased a whole generation of heroes. At number 10 is DC's Golden Age Justice Society of America. The Justice Society of America represented the foundational World War II generation of superhero comics. Featuring icons like Alan Scott and Jay Garrick, they anchored the best-selling Jeff Johns run, uniquely mentoring modern legacy heroes. Then, the publisher abruptly reset continuity, executing a massive editorial overhaul that caused these heroes to disappear from history. In 2011, DC initiated the New 52 reboot, demanding a younger universe where Superman was definitively the first public superhero. To achieve this, the original roster was eradicated from the Prime Earth timeline, replaced by unrecognizable alternate universe versions on Earth 2. Comic book fans had furious opinions about that corporate decision to wipe the board clean, incensed that decades of emotional legacy were sacrificed for a compressed timeline. Although some individual elements eventually crawled back years later via Doomsday Clock, the generation never fully recovered its former status, largely relegated to background roles and forever robbed of their true timeline positions today. At number 9 is Marvel's Academy X Mutants. The new X-Men class, including Surge, Hellion, and Dust, emerged during the early 2000s as a thriving student body at the Xavier Institute. They embodied a golden era of population growth, driving popular teen titles and acting as the logical evolution of the mutant metaphor, a flourishing, diverse youth preparing to inherit tomorrow. Suddenly, editorial management panicked over this expansion. Believing mutants had become too mainstream, Marvel utilized the 2005 House of M crossover to trigger M-Day, stripping powers from nearly every member of the species. For these students, it was an absolute massacre. Writers weaponized villains like William Stryker to literally blow up a bus filled with depowered kids, violently culling them to enforce an endangered survivor brand. Editorial management had panicked over perceived mutant market saturation. They utilized the bus explosion to violently enforce a new endangered survivor brand status quo, actively sacrificing a popular roster of students to reset the franchise. At number 8 is DC's 90s Young Justice generation. Tim Drake, Connor Kent, Bart Allen, and Cassie Sandsmark were the definitive teen heroes of the late 90s and 2000s. Anchoring beloved series like Young Justice and Teen Titans, this highly interconnected generation evolved together to bridge the gap between classic sidekicks and the future DC universe. Then, the publisher drastically overhauled their mainline continuity, causing this entire generation of heroes to vanish. The New 52 reboot explicitly erased their collective history to force a clean slate for new readers. Tim Drake was suddenly never Robin, Bart Allen was replaced by Bar-Tor, an unrelated fugitive from a dystopian future, and Connor Kent was aggressively stripped of his Superman ties, totally annulling their profound friendships. Comic book fans held massive backlash about the sweeping corporate decision to wipe the board clean. The subsequent Teen Titans comic is widely considered a creative disaster, leaving longtime readers deeply resenting those forced, edgy personalities. While later writers eventually reunited them, constant shifts left them forever adrift and overshadowed. Losing a team is bad, but wait until you see Marvel force their newest recruits into a literal death match just to chase a movie trend. Keep watching, because we're about to cover a 30-year continuity vaporized overnight by one cynical corporate reset. At number 7 is DC's original Flash family. After Barry Allen's demise in 1985, Wally West inherited the iconic speedster mantle. Over the next 25 years, an expansive and deeply cherished network of rapid heroes flourished alongside him, featuring figures like Jesse Quick, Max Mercury, and Wally's twins, Ira and Jai. This interconnected roster proved that successors could permanently eclipse their forebears, starring in an incredibly acclaimed series. However, driven by corporate synergy and a craving for Silver Age nostalgia, executives orchestrated the 2011 Flashpoint event. This sweeping narrative reboot established a youthful Barry as the sole Scarlet Speedster. Consequently, Wally, his immediate relatives, and his diverse mentors were erased from canon. Dismantling this beloved network centralized intellectual property solely on one man. The absolute deletion of the specific hero millions grew up reading ignited an unprecedented, enduring outrage that haunted convention panels indefinitely. Although management ultimately relented by returning Wally years later, that rich 90s dynamic remained permanently fractured, necessitating endless, clumsy retcons to repair. At number 6 is Marvel's New Warriors. Debuting in the early 90s, the New Warriors, including Night Thrasher, Namorita, Microbe, and Speedball, stood as Marvel's premier independent teen team. Distinct from standard sidekicks, these working-class vigilantes tackled heavy social themes, anchoring a highly successful 75-issue run that cemented their dynamic. Yet to launch the massive 2006 Civil War crossover, executives required a sacrificial lamb. Leadership violently warped their established characterizations, transforming these capable youth into incompetent, fame-obsessed reality television stars before immediately blowing them up in Stamford, Connecticut. This localized explosion killed over 600 civilians, including 60 children at a nearby elementary school, structurally overriding the team's entire legacy just to provide a line-wide inciting incident. Longtime readers were disgusted by this blatant character assassination, horrified that a deeply respected squad was abruptly reduced to a careless, catastrophic punchline. While certain members like Speedball survived only to endure grim, traumatizing reinventions, the broader franchise's reputation sustained fatal damage. Every subsequent attempt to revitalize the poisoned brand has flat-out failed, stranding them forever. At number 5 is Marvel's Avengers Academy. Following Dark Reign, Marvel introduced a brilliant group of troubled adolescents through Avengers Academy. Featuring complex figures like Hazmat, Metal, and Reptile, these kids were initially identified by Norman Osborn for their villainous potential, before Hank Pym intervened to guide them toward heroism. This emotionally resonant premise drove nearly 40 critically acclaimed issues focusing on healing. However, to capitalize on the mainstream Hunger Games craze in 2012, publishers drafted this specific cast into a brutal battle royale called Avengers Arena. Tossing aside nuanced development, creators forced these vulnerable youths into Murder World to slaughter one another solely for cheap shock value. Audiences were horrified by this profoundly grim premise, viewing it as a remarkably callous method to violently clear the teenage roster ahead of the Marvel Now publishing initiative. Although select survivors eventually surfaced as minor background fixtures, the cohesive and compelling narrative trajectory of this particular class was permanently derailed by senseless trauma, leaving their potential wasted forever. At number 4 is DC's pre-Zero Hour Legion of Superheroes. The original Legion of Superheroes constituted a massive, unparalleled 30-year continuity situated in the 31st century. Boasting dozens of intricately linked champions, this era of heroes possessed the richest lore in the medium, dominating sales charts throughout the 70s and 80s under visionaries like Paul Levitz. However, because their origins were deeply entangled with an already retconned Superboy, their narrative became notoriously convoluted. Rather than meticulously untangling this web, leadership weaponized the 1994 zero-hour temporal collapse to vaporize this foundational roster. The futuristic landscape was scrubbed clean to introduce a rebooted, youth-oriented iteration built from scratch for modern consumers. Dedicated loyalists felt profoundly betrayed by this clinical deletion. Overnight, 30 years of intricate character progression, marriages, and interstellar epics were systematically discarded, permanently splintering a once-devoted audience. Although later writers attempted to resurrect the classic roster through subsequent reboots, the incessant timeline tampering fatally fractured the property's momentum, leaving the franchise struggling to sustain even one ongoing monthly publication today. Now for the top 3, where publishers didn't just reboot these heroes, they actively slaughtered them to feed their own Silver Age nostalgia. Stick around, because our number 1 spot broke a timeline so badly, the publisher had to outright cancel the book. At number 3 is DC's modern-era legacy replacements. Throughout the 90s, DC fully embraced legacy transitions by introducing a fresh wave of successors. Kyle Rayner, Connor Hawke, Ryan Choi, and Jason Rusch successfully assumed legendary mantles, guiding the Justice League through pivotal crises while injecting modernized, relatable energy into the publisher's forefront. Yet, during the late 2000s, executives driven by overwhelming nostalgia for their own childhoods orchestrated a ruthless, line-wide purge. Through high-profile revivals, Silver Age stalwarts like Hal Jordan and Ray Palmer were forcefully reinstated as the absolute definitive iterations of these personas. Consequently, these modern pioneers were systematically demoted, stripped of their abilities, or gruesomely assassinated, a fate epitomized by Ryan Choi's senseless execution. This targeted regression fractured the readership, enraging loyalists who had dedicated 15 years to these replacements only to watch them discarded as temporary understudies. Although certain individuals maintain a passionate niche following today, this class permanently lost the premier, solo-starring prestige they actively commanded prior to those undeniably regressive corporate resurrections. At number 2 is Marvel's MC2 Universe generation. Anchored by Mayday Parker, the MC2 imprint offered a meticulously crafted future where iconic champions aged naturally. Featuring breakout stars like J2 and American Dream, this optimistic reality secured immense popularity, propelling Spider-Girl to become the longest-tenured female-led title in company history via fierce grassroots support. Eventually, upper management opted to systematically dismantle this bright tomorrow to artificially inflate the stakes of the 2014 Spider-Verse spectacle. Authors invaded this sanctuary, explicitly slaughtering Mayday's heroic father and brutalizing her peers to feed crossover antagonists. This vibrant epoch was functionally liquidated to clear commercial space for newer variants like Spider-Gwen. Devoted followers perceived this unprovoked assault as pure creative vandalism, appalled that a self-contained, joyous domain was sacrificed merely to supply cheap thrills for a mainline blockbuster. Although the legendary heroine herself barely escaped total destruction, her native continuity was irrevocably discarded. The publishing line perished, rendering a once-thriving assembly of futuristic defenders entirely obsolete within Marvel's modern canon. At number 1 is DC's Infinity Inc., cameoing in 1983 before launching their flagship title in 1984. Infinity Inc. operated as the premier successors of Earth 2. Comprising offspring of the Golden Age Justice Society, including Jade, Obsidian, and Fury, this critically acclaimed roster allowed writers to explore complex themes like familial trauma and youthful rebellion within a unique parallel dimension where original champions actually aged and married. However, the monumental 1985 crisis on Infinite Earths crossover physically collapsed the multiverse, obliterating their native reality. Although these individuals survived the cosmic consolidation, their fundamental narrative purpose was ruined. Within the consolidated timeline, the entire Earth 2 reality was eliminated. While some parents like Alan Scott had their ages preserved, characters tied to erased histories, like Fury, daughter of the Earth 2 Wonder Woman, were forced into agonizing narrative gymnastics. These convoluted retcons stripped away their defining heritage. Audiences despised these bewildering adjustments, as the agonizing narrative gymnastics required to justify their existence rendered their ongoing monthly series utterly incomprehensible, prompting a swift cancellation. Even though scattered members ultimately joined modern lineups, their unified identity as foundational heirs was wiped out. Entire generations vanished, but their stories still matter. Comment the biggest loss, press the subscribe button now, and turn on notifications for regular updates.